Today, we're diving into a source that examines two of the most personal and, let's be honest, often distorted topics for believers: our money and our relationship with the world around us. Let's get right into it. You know, this verse from Matthew, it's really the heart of our entire explainer. The source we're breaking down argues this isn't just some poetic line. Nope, it's a diagnostic question. It's the central axis that everything else is going to spin around. So how do you actually find out where your treasure is? Well, the source material we're looking at says there are two parts of our lives that basically act like a mirror to our heart. First, how we deal with our finances. And second, how we position ourselves in relation to the culture we live in. And in this is where things get really interesting. See, the source doesn't just describe these areas. It actually challenges some of the most common things we hear about them, asking, hey, do these ideas really hold up when you look at the scriptures? So let's break it down. Okay, first up, the source titles this section, The Myth of the Tithe. Right away, that title tells you we're about to question some pretty big foundational assumptions. So look at this comparison here. The common teaching, what many of us have heard, is that a tithe is 10% of your cash income, and it's a rule for every believer. But when the source goes back to Leviticus, it finds something totally different. The biblical tithe was agricultural, crops and animals, from a very specific place, the land of Canaan. It was never applied to wages. So a carpenter, for instance, wasn't actually commanded to tithe their income. Big difference, right? And it turns out the system was way more complex than just a simple 10% rule. The source breaks it down into three separate tithes. There was one to support the Levites, the priest, another one to fund national religious festivals, and then a third one every 3 years that basically acted as social welfare for the poor. It was a very specific system for a very specific nation. Okay, so this is the crucial point. According to the source, it all comes down to this verse in Hebrews. This is like the theological linchpin. The argument is, if the entire tithing system was legally designed to support the Levitical priesthood, what happens when that priesthood is fulfilled and replaced by Christ? Well, the Bible itself says the law connected to it has to change too. So if the Old Covenant model of tithing doesn't just carry over, what does the New Testament actually teach us about giving? Let's take a look. The source points us straight to 2 Corinthians to lay out a completely different way of thinking, what it calls grace giving. It's not about a fixed percentage. It's proportional. It's purposeful, something you decide in your own heart beforehand. It's cheerful, and this is a big one. It's not compelled. It's free from outside pressure. That's a huge shift from a legal rule to a heart response. And I absolutely love this detail the source pulls out about that word cheerful. It doesn't just mean you're, okay with giving. The Greek word is hilaros. It's where we get our word hilarious. It paints this picture of a joy that is just overflowing, almost bursting at the seams, not the quiet, reluctant feeling of someone just trying to check a box. So, if it's not law or pressure, what's the motivation? What's the engine behind this hilarious giving? The source argues it's this verse right here. The motivation is an obligation. It's a direct response to the ultimate act of giving, Christ's own sacrifice. That becomes the model, and it becomes the motor for everything else. Naturally, this leads us to a pretty modern distortion of giving that the source tackles head-on. You've probably heard of it, the prosperity gospel, which kind of turns giving into a spiritual investment strategy. You have almost certainly heard this verse, or at least this piece of it, used to promise a massive financial return on your giving. The idea is if you sacrifice for the gospel, you'll get 100 times back in houses and lands and all this stuff. But here's the thing. This just brilliantly illustrates the danger of taking verses out of context. The source points out that the full, complete verse includes two little words that are almost always left out, with persecutions. Well, that completely changes the meaning, doesn't it? It goes from a promise of easy wealth to a promise of a new family, a new community, but one that's going to face hardship together. And to hammer this point home, the source brings up the Apostle Paul's own life as a reality check. His testimony isn't about constant abundance. He says he learned to be content no matter what his situation was, whether he was full or hungry, had plenty, or was in need. This directly contradicts the whole idea that if you're faithful and give correctly, you're guaranteed to get rich. All right, so we've looked at how we handle our money. Now let's shift gears and turn to that second area that reveals our heart's treasure, our relationship with the world. I mean, what does that biblical command to be separate actually look like in real life? The source breaks down a really key passage in 2 Corinthians into these 5 fundamental clashes. Think of them as 5 either-or statements that define a believer's identity. You can't have real fellowship between righteousness and unrighteousness. You can't have an agreement between Christ and Belial, which is just an old term for wickedness. They are presented as things that just cannot mix. Because those things are so incompatible, you run into this huge danger the source calls syncretism. Now, this isn't about just abandoning your faith completely. It's much more subtle. It's about corrupting your faith by mixing it with ideas and practices that come from a system that's fundamentally opposed to it. The classic biblical example of this is the golden calf. But what's really fascinating is the detail in this verse. Aaron doesn't stand up and say, "Hey everyone, tomorrow we're going to have a feast to this calf." No, he says it's a feast to the Lord. That is the absolute essence of syncretism, trying to worship the right God, but using the wrong methods borrowed straight from the pagan culture they just left in Egypt. So, how do we get this right without falling into a ditch? The source argues that people often veer into one of two unbiblical extremes. On one side, you have total isolation, just withdrawing from the world completely. On the other side, you have accommodation, where the church just starts to look and sound exactly like the world. The biblical path, it argues, is something in the middle, a costly engagement. You're present and active, but you remain spiritually distinct. And that brings us to our final section, which really pulls everything we've talked about, our giving, our separation, back to that very first question we started with. Where is your treasure? So here's the bottom line. The crucial point is this. Whether we're talking about our bank accounts or our cultural habits, the source argues they are both pointing to the exact same thing. They're both expressions of our ultimate loyalty. They answer the question of who or what really has our allegiance. You know, the entire argument we've walked through today is that believers are fundamentally citizens of another kingdom. And so the final question the source leaves us with is a really personal one. It's a challenge that goes way beyond the information on these slides. What does your life, the way you give, the way you engage with the world, declare loyalty to?